Palestinian health officials say more than 90 people have been killed and dozens more wounded in a third day of Israeli airstrikes across Gaza, bringing the death toll since Tuesday to more than 500. Medical staff say Israeli attacks have targeted residential areas in both northern and southern areas of the Gaza Strip, while families, including women and children, were sleeping. Israel has blamed the renewed fighting on Hamas, saying the militant group rejected a new proposal that departed from the ceasefire deal secured in January. Doron Spielman is a former IDF spokesman and joins me now. Doron Spielman, welcome to Radio National Breakfast.
Thank you for having me, Sally.
Do you think that Israel's renewed strikes on Gaza, are they justified in your view?
I think that the common sense response to what happened here on October 7th, the massacre of Israeli civilians where Hamas came over the border and went home to home, destroying, massacring, and raping parents and children, is the destruction of that army and the return of every single hostage of Israel's back home to their family safely. That's what brought us into this war in the first place. And any agreement or any situation that would leave Hamas in power is completely untenable. So the common sense response, I think, for any army would be to destroy the army that is carried out this massacre and bring our hostages home. And this is what we're doing right now.
There has been a ceasefire process in place. It was in phase 1, and then the process was supposed to move on to phase 2 starting on February the 4th. Why has Israel remained wanting to stay in phase 1 rather than going into phase 2 as was planned?
I appreciate the question. First of all, phase 1 was insane by many standards, and the only reason why we did it is because we wanted to bring our people home. We allowed 1,000 convicted Palestinian terrorists who had blood on their hands, at least half of them, for the killing of Israelis, back into the streets of Gaza and into Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, in order to receive 33 living and dead hostages back to Israel. Essentially, we freed the same people that carried out the massacre in order to bring our people home. It was an enormous price to pay, and we said that there is no situation where we can allow Hamas to remain in power on the border, and they're not willing to give up their power. They're not willing to relinquish power. They're not willing to allow the men and women that are still being held hostage to come home, and therefore phase 2 is not an option.
Doron Spielman, when it's coming to those Palestinians who were released, it's important to state that a significant number of those had not been convicted. They were detained, correct?
Of the 2,000, about 1,000 of them, 900 of them, were being held for crossing over the border or abetting in terror. And 1,000 of them, in fact, were the ones who I'm speaking of. That's why I said 1,000 were directly involved in terror activities. Again, like I said, half of them have, it's been, absolutely clear evidence of them destroying, raping, slicing, massacring people. And so of the 2,000 that were released, around half of them were detained, and around half of them, 1,000 of them, were absolute murderers and terrorists. That's why I said 1,000.
You're listening to Radio National Breakfast, and my guest is Doron Spielman, a former IDF spokesperson. Given that we know the demographics of Gaza, that children and women make up a huge part of the population, why have there been so many civilian casualties in these Israeli attacks, and is that acceptable to you?
First of all, our attacks and our strikes are happening simply against the Hamas leadership, many of whom are trying to hide in civilian areas, regrettably, if, of course, they don't value the life of their civilian population, which is why they hide there. Israel has probably done more than any army in the history of the world to try to get civilians of its enemy out of the way so that it can strike its enemy. But there are limitations, and Hamas is trying to prevent civilians from leaving the area. And this is what is required, unfortunately, to kill the people that are not only carried out, we have to understand, the terror attack on October 7th, but we identified that they have recruited another 7,000 or 8,000 terrorists back into their terror links by providing them with the humanitarian aid that the international community has been giving them. And those same terrorists and Hamas Hamas are planning further attacks. And so we really have no choice but to strike them before they can carry out such an attack.
When we look at the roadmap that was laid out, Israel, you were saying that phase 1 was not satisfactory, but in phase 2, all of the remaining hostages would be released. There'd be the complete withdrawal of Israeli soldiers from Gaza. What was it about phase 2 that Israel broke away from this plan that had been laid out? Discussions were supposed to start on February 4, and that didn't occur. If you didn't want phase 1 to continue, why not negotiate into phase 2 where you get to move forward?
Again, for us, it's very simple. And this is I think the common sense answer that any country would have. We paid an enormous ransom for the first 33 people by allowing these terrorists back in the streets. Under no circumstances can we have a reality in which Hamas would be in power, armed just over our borders as they were before October 7th. I just drove to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, earlier today, Hamas shot rockets at Tel Aviv. As I was driving into Jerusalem, I had to pull over on the side of the road because Houthis, which are another Iranian-funded terror regime, they're all part of the same Iranian axis, fired at Jerusalem. So I went through 2 rocket attacks by terror organizations. It's clear that leaving Hamas on our borders is absolutely impossible. And any agreement that would cause that to happen is something Israelis, like any normal people, couldn't live with, which is why we're striking the Hamas leadership. It can all end.
Well, as we were saying,
Doron
Spielman, we're also talking about significant civilian casualties. We know that aid was cut off in the past few weeks. That's meant that women and children who've been brought into hospitals in Gaza. We were speaking to an Australian doctor who's working at the Baptist Hospital in the north of Gaza. They have 3 ventilators for that entire population. There's not even basic pain relief, which means children with significant injuries are not receiving relief. Why not send that medication in? If you're targeting Hamas and you think you're being successful in that, but at the same time, you know that civilians will be hit, and you know that if those medications are not there, there will be a significant amount of unnecessary suffering for severely wounded civilians.
The medications are there.
We spoke to a doctor and they are not, sir.
Well, I know that the medications are there because enough medications have been sent into Gaza in order to heal all the civilians of Gaza. They are in Gaza. However, you know as well as I do where they're located. Hamas has intercepted all the medicines.
What's your evidence
of
that?
All of the food. You can just simply go online and see Hamas shooting towards all the humanitarian convoys as they enter into Gaza with medicine and food, and taking over those convoys and driving them. Plus, Israel has released numerous videos of them taking over convoys, and we know how is Hamas.
I'm asking about medication, and we've not seen any evidence that is there. And as we say, the doctors who desperately need it, it is not there for them. We're speaking to a very experienced Australian.
It is there.
Mr. Snott.
The reason it is there, and the reason that doctor, unfortunately, if it's true, and he does not have access to the medicines, he knows as well as we do that you have enough humanitarian aid, both medical and food, for 3 or 4 months in Gaza. The only reason why it may not be in that hospital, if we choose to believe him, and I don't know this doctor, but of course, many of them work for the Hamas, the health ministry, maybe he does not.
No,
it is
he
because
doesn't.
they are being held. It is because they are being held by Hamas and either sold in the black market for absolutely extortionate prices or being used by Hamas to recruit additional fighters. This is not a secret. This has been published. There are reports about this. There's enough medicine and aid that went in. The problem is, one of the reasons why Hamas feels they can do this is after they steal this aid, and we have doctors and people who are visibly upset for a lack of food and a lack of medicine, they go onto the international media, and the international media buys the story, blames the international community. Israel has not impeded. For months, we have sent tens of millions of pounds of aid into the Gaza Strip.
And that was suspended 2 weeks ago, Mr. Spielman.
Exactly, and there's still 3 or 4 months of aid and food that are left, and everyone knows this. The only reason why it has been suspended is because the international community is not willing to take the steps to ensure that it reaches the people. Unfortunately, it's reaching the terrorists. So the international community, maybe unwittingly, is actually funding the same terrorists that brought
Mr. Spielman, the United Nations and other
Gaza.
organisations, workers have been working hard to get those supplies to those who need it. And as we saw during the week, a number of those UN staff lost their lives in that pursuit. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you for your time this morning, Mr. Spielman. Thank you.
Thank you.